Good afternoon. Thank you. Thanks for spending some time with me this afternoon. These past few weeks have given me a lot of silent time, especially during my quarantine period. It was a time to reflect. I've thought about my experience in Africa, and I've thought about your experiences here too. I've thought about my reactions to what I've seen, and I've reflected on your reactions as well. I really wanted to help you grow in your understanding of Africa, its peoples, cultures, and history. But I realize how much I have grown by being here. I've learned so much from Jeremy and the other guest presenters. I've learned from the Africans I've encountered, and I've learned from so many of you. This period of reflection has caused me to do quite a bit of writing and rewriting about what I still want to share with you. And the result of all this thinking, writing, and rewriting is this talk. I'm going to start with concepts of African time versus Western time. And then I'll define some terms which I use which may be unfamiliar to you. Then I'll do a really short review of West African history with at least half this presentation devoted to terrorist threats in the region today. Finally, I'm going to conclude this talk with some uplifting African stories my husband shared with me, which he saw on the TV show 60 Minutes. They've just been broadcast, actually. I've been thinking about the concept of time and how our Western patterns of time, of being so precise about time, could create frustrations for us here in Africa. I see you shaking your heads yes. I myself pride myself on being on time. I'm the person that usually arrives early to any appointment, and I expect others to be on time too. And if they're not, I consider it disrespectful. However, when I had my Fulbright scholarship to Brazil, I was confronted with Brazilian ideas around time which were so different from my own. I would show up for class at 9 a.m., but class never started at 9 a.m. I was lucky if it started by 9:15. The professor and the members of the class all had to greet each other, and these greetings were more than just hello. They greeted each other with kisses on each cheek. They said hello, bom dia, and how are you, como va você? And they actually listened for an answer. Eventually, I slowed myself down as I learned to embrace these cultural differences. And I started following Brazilian time, and that experience in Brazil helped me to accept what I call African time without so much judgment. I cannot deny that at times it wasn't frustrating waiting in the heat for a shuttle bus. But I said to myself, we're on African time, and my attitude changed for the better. For centuries, Africans lived their lives in rhythm with the seasons. A wet time, a dry time, a time when the winds blew north, a time when they blew south, a hunger time, a time of plenty, a time to find a new land to plant, a time to find new pastures, a time for work, a time for play, a time for growing into adulthood, and a time at last to prepare for death. Time was endless. Like water on the earth, it moved in cycles at an even pace. European rule changed the lives of many Africans, and perhaps the most important instrument of change was the clock. The clock did much to change African cultural patterns. It has no pulsating rhythm. It ignores the seasons. The clock makes a straight line of time, like a yardstick, and it divides the line into seconds, minutes, hours. And to each segment, it assigns a value, translated into money. Under European rule, many Africans had to learn that work in a factory or on a plantation began at a certain hour. It ended at another hour. One no longer ate when his belly told him to. He waited until the whistle blew. He was paid on a certain day at a certain hour. The amount of time he received, the amount of money he received depended on the hours and minutes he had given to the job. Time was money. No work, no pay. Time became money, and for many Africans, money became the means to obtain food, clothing, and other needed things. Money was especially necessary to pay taxes to colonial governments. No longer did a man trade a cow for a barrel of grain, or a spear for a finely made bow with arrows. He bought these now with money. Barter, with all of its looseness, gave way to a cash economy with its dollars and cents precision. And endless time gave way to the relentless, even ticking of the clock. Only with money could the African who worked on the palm oil plantation, in the hemp factory, or in the copper mine enjoy the fruits of European civilization. Things like shoes, shirts and trousers, a bicycle, medical care, a ride on a bus or a train, even food and a place to sleep. Farming villagers too needed money to enjoy European goods, steel plows, sharp, durable hoes with which to loosen soil and keep down the weeds, sharp knives for harvesting grain, fertilizers to help grow a more abundant crops, vaccines for cattle. To obtain money, farmers sold what crops they could in villages and city markets. Many Africans came to depend on whites for a livelihood. Whites in turn depended on selling African copper, palm oil, and other products on a world market. And this was a fickle market. When there was a drought, if demand for palm oil slackened, when the price of copper fell, Africans suffered. There were fewer jobs then and less money. Many found it hard to return to the village and pick up traditional ways again. This is not to say that all Africans changed their way of life. Millions went unaffected by the white man's ways, continuing to lead lives that had been traditional for centuries. Some left their villages for a time, worked in the cities, and then returned to take up old ways once again. But a trend was there. And that trend continues today, with Africans becoming more and more urbanized. And I wonder what the impact of all of this will be. That's something I've been thinking about while in isolation. Now I'm going to define a couple of terms which some of you have asked questions about, so I thought I'd address them here. First, I want to explain some terms I use for measuring time. This is the most widely way of defining time in the world today, what you see here on the screen. BC representing the years before the birth of Christ, and the year 1 AD, roughly the time Jesus Christ was born. And then this is the system I've been using in my presentations. It's an alternative for BC and AD. The term Common Era, sometimes called Current Era or Christian Era, has been around since the early 1700s. However, its use in textbooks and media have really been on the upswing since the 1980s. The rationale for this alternative terminology was to have a system for measuring time that was not tied to one particular religion, but instead was religion neutral. And for me, in my teaching career, it was expected that I adopt these terms. What I've attempted to do in my presentations is use both systems, and I hope that has not been confusing to you. I also want to bring your attention to what historians now are moving away from using the term slaves to enslaved persons. It's an attempt to see these people as human beings rather than just commodities to be traded. I know that to some this strikes is just another lame attempt at political correctness, but I want to point out that even the framers of the U.S. Constitution used terms enslaved Africans and enslaved people. And in my work, I plan to gradually incorporate these new terms because it reminds me that enslaved people were not merely property, but individuals who were kidnapped and sold into involuntary servitude. One more term, kind of a hideous term. When I was growing up, Africa was labeled the Dark Continent, a land of unknown, a land of mystery. And for true, of much of its long history, sub-Saharan Africa was unknown to much of the Western world. But Africa was never a dark continent. Great civilizations and empires did exist in many parts of Africa before European colonization. But this same region is now also facing new challenges to its stability with the increase in terrorist activity in West Africa. So I'll discuss some of those current threats facing West Africa. So how do we know what we know? And of course I start with history and pose that question. I think it's important to ask these questions because unfortunately much of what we have been learning has been written by foreigners, conquerors, missionaries, and adventurers. Today though, there's a lot of new historical research being conducted to figure out what really happened, and as a result, early African history is being more accurately reinterpreted. Information about early Africa has come to us in three major ways. First, by way of Berber writings and Islamic scholars and texts. Second, from archaeological excavations, like in the ancient cities of Geni-Geno and Timbuktu, and also through the practice of oral histories passed down through the generations. Each of these methods verifies Africa had centralized governments, local trade routes, and international trade routes, and vibrant cultures. African history was written in European languages during the colonial era beginning in the late 1800s, and it's been around in Arabic for centuries. But in West Africa, written history is something new. Societies in the Sahel and the Savannah regions of West Africa have long kept their own histories in their own languages orally in the form of stories. Imagine relying on someone's memory to hold your people's history. In many parts of West Africa, this job was carried out by the griot. A griot is an oral historian who has memorized the genealogy, history, and traditions of their people. Griots usually carry this important responsibility from one generation to the next, so that the stories of their people will never be lost or forgotten. A griot spends years training to memorize stories that go back for centuries. The study, practice, and memorization can begin as early as 8 years old. Often these recollections take the form of long poems, which in some ways are similar to the epics of Homer in ancient Greece. The griot's preparation also includes learning to play an instrument to accompany the hundreds of songs and stories that make up his heritage. The role performed by griots has been such an important one for the preservation of a person's history. This is especially valuable during a time where technology wasn't as evolved as it is now, and the whole lineage and history of peoples could have been forgotten otherwise. A griot's role was even more vital for communities that weren't learned in reading or writing. And in the past, griots also served as diplomats and advisors of their villages. And it's safe to say that their work is no less valid than written histories. American writer Alex Haley met a griot in 1966 that had memorized the entire story of the village of Juffure, Gambia, to a date 3 centuries in the past when he claimed his ancestor, Kunta Kinte, was enslaved. He wrote the book Roots in part about what he learned from a griot. And when the miniseries based on the book was shown on television in 1977, it became a sensation. It demonstrated the appalling experiences of enslaved people. And for the first time, the general public was able to see a historically realistic portrait of Africans and African American families in a dignified way. Roots went on to become the most watched miniseries in history. For centuries, the griot tradition has been handed down exclusively from father to son, from generation to generation. But Sonia Jobarty, who comes from a prominent griot family, has carried on the legacy of this male-dominated tradition to become a virtuoso choral player. She's the first female to professionally play this 21-string harp made from a gourd. And she sings both traditional griot tales as well as her own compositions in concerts all over the world. Her music is featured also on the film soundtrack of Mandela, The Long Walk to Freedom. When I think about early West African history, I think about the dynamic trade that occurred through the Sahara Desert, which connected the Mediterranean world with sub-Saharan Africa. It spurred the development of the great West African kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. These African civilizations, and others too, were a big part of a global trade network that is not often portrayed in our Western-centric approach to African history. The Songhai, the last of these great kingdoms, had a ruler called Ashki Mohammed. He pushed Songhai's boundaries all the way to the Atlantic. And under his rule, famous universities were established in cities of Gao, Timbuktu, and Geno. Thousands of teachers offered courses in astronomy, mathematics, music, and much more. They had a medical school where complex operations like cataract surgery were performed that were not attempted in Europe until 200 years later. And later, when Europeans enslaved members of the former Songhai Empire, many of these people were highly educated, and they taught Caribbean and American farmers successful tools and techniques to ease the burden of their daily work. The empire's glory, though, didn't last more than 100 years. Most people resisted the king's efforts to convert them to Islam, and they resented his use of Muslim advisors. Without broad public support, he was overthrown by his sons in 1528. Disputes over who would succeed the throne also weakened this empire. Songhai was divided into many different small states. In 1591, an army from Morocco was able to invade Songhai and capture its most important cities. The Moroccans possessed a key weapon that dramatically changed warfare: the musket. Normal trade was disrupted, and a great empire came to an end. Parts of West Africa remained under Moroccan control for 2 centuries. The French conquered the land in the mid-19th century, and it became part of French West Africa. In 1946, the area then called the French Sudan became an overseas territory of the French Union. In November 1958, what is now the country of Mali was proclaimed the Sudanese Republic, a self-governing member of the French community. In 1959, the Sudanese Republic and Senegal, a former French colony on the Atlantic coast, united to form the Federation of Mali. But political differences led Senegal to withdraw, declare its own independence in 1960, and then Mali separately became independent at that time too. So here's a map of Mali today, and here is its size as an empire 700 years ago. You can kind of see the difference there. By the time gold and silver were discovered in the Americas, Timbuktu's days as a center of trade declined. And as trade in enslaved people diverted African trade toward the Atlantic, trade across the desert also declined. Today, a few small caravans arrive from northern Mali, but most of this trade is disappearing too. I think about how the encounters with Europeans profoundly disrupted this continent. So I recommend a new book that represents really good scholarship. And we desperately need good scholarship about West Africa. The book is called A Fistful of Shells: West Africa from the Slave Trade to the Age of Revolution. One reviewer said, and I quote now, This is a sprawling and nuanced look at the often surprising success that Africans had throughout their first 400 years of their encounter with Europe, along with the steady depletion of a continent, with a powerful lament about the lack of academic interest in Africa's pre-colonial eras. Now I shift to terrorism in West Africa. Both North Africa and West Africa have seen an increase in the spread of terrorism over the past decade. Much of this increase has been concentrated in the Sahel region. It's in dark gray on this map. There are no easy, universal reasons for terror in Africa. The causes of violence and insurgency in African nations vary a great deal. This is a huge continent with tremendous cultural and language differences at work, and the only true shared experience is a history of European colonialism. There are many reasons for terrorism in Africa. The challenges of climate change on this continent, poor governance, criticisms about the West's response to terrorism are all reasons. Religious and ethnic differences, and certainly Islamic insurgency, which has gripped parts of Africa, these are major reasons too. I also want you to keep in mind that violence against civilians in one African nation can differ greatly from another, just like religious violence in India differs from religious violence in Kosovo. Finally, terrorist organizations may take root in one country, but they're not constricted to a country's borders. They often spread beyond mere country demarcations. Rather than discuss every terrorist organization operating in North and West Africa, I thought it would be more interesting, perhaps more vivid, to focus on how two countries have been dealing with this problem. And these countries are Nigeria and Mali. And I start with Nigeria first. When I think about how to talk about how Boko Haram got a foothold in Nigeria, I look to geography and the contrast between the North and the South. I've just added a dividing line here between these two regions to give you a rough idea of how divided this country is. Keep this line in mind as I present a series of maps which will vividly illustrate the differences. The capital city, Lagos, is in the south. It's a big port city on the Gulf of Guinea with the largest population in Africa at an estimated 21 million people, although no one really knows for sure. This city is the center of Nigeria's cultural and political life. The South and the southwestern states is where the wealth is. It's also where the oil is, and you can see that outlined in the square I put here. But it's not just wealth that separates the regions. It's also the quality of government to respond to the needs of all of its people. This map shows the percentage of vaccinated one-year-olds per state, a good example for the quality of social services provided to people in different regions. The greener the state is, the more vaccinated it is. And the Southwest is much greener than the rest of the country. And again, I'm making the point that services to citizens cut across a north-south axis. Religious differences also come into play. Nigeria is split between Muslims and Christians along geographic lines. About 46% of Nigerians are Christian, and they're concentrated in the south. About 53% are Muslim, and they're concentrated in the north and represented here in purple and yellow. The northern areas have implemented some degree of Sharia or Islamic law. The poor and less governed regions of Nigeria also tend to be Muslim, and again, this is divided roughly on a north-south axis. These factors, wealth, governance, and religion, set the stage for Boko Haram's emergence as a major force in Nigeria. Boko Haram was founded in 2002 by Mohammed Yusuf in northeastern Nigeria. They said their goal was to uproot the corruption and injustice in Nigeria, which it blamed on Western influences, and they wanted to impose Sharia or Islamic law. In 2009, Yusuf was arrested and he was killed by soldiers while in police custody. In 2015, the group pledged allegiance to ISIS and took the name Islamic State, West African Province, ISWAP, also known as Islamic State in West Africa, or ISWA. The next year, the group split, with one faction retaining that name and the other reverting back to the original title. I point this out because the name changes can be confusing. They're confusing to me, frankly. But the important takeaway here is that Boko Haram is alive and well in northern Nigeria. In the past decade, Boko Haram has also been increasingly deadly violent, particularly in reaction to the murder of their leader. They also have affiliated with other Islamic terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab, which is raising havoc in Somalia. The world became aware of Boko Haram in 2014 when nearly 300 girls were kidnapped from their boarding school in Chibok. Some of the girls managed to escape, while others were later freed. The fate of nearly 100 still remains unknown. Chibok abduction remains one of the most well-known examples, but this practice of kidnapping is widespread. It preceded the girls' school's kidnappings, and it continues to this day. Children, especially girls, are kidnapped because it's a cost-effective way of forcing females to join their ranks without having to spend money to recruit them. In captivity, they've been required to convert to Islam, forced into sham marriages with terrorists, or sold as sex slaves.